First of all, thank you very much, the two of you. That was an incredible analysis and such detail, and we're very grateful to you. My question actually is about the Australian Labor Party and Bill Shorten. Now, as I remember it, finally the ALP back in the Vietnam days did come out against the proper involvement in Vietnam as part of the American. And under Rudd, actually, he was very clear, and the Labor was very clear about the war in Iraq. What on earth is your assessment of what is happening now, if you have any inklings, of why the Federal Labor Party, I mean the parliamentary party and the leader, is just going along with what Abbott, in the name of, unity? Have you any insights about that? Because it's in such contrast to what a Labor Party has done in the past about the wars you've been talking about.
Thanks.
Wynne, thank you. I don't have insight so much as I've got a prospective insight, and that is very soon I'm going to be among a small team of people who'll be briefing Tanya Plibersek about what's going on. I think she desperately needs it. I don't know. I think Labor are mesmerised with the view that they can't show any kind of hesitation about the American alliance, otherwise they'll be ripped apart by the Libs. And I think those days are past. I think if we had some honest, intelligent, knowledgeable Labor people who stood up and said, look, this is crap what we're doing, we shouldn't be doing it, let them get on with it. We've got our own issues to worry about here. And all we're doing by having this being part of this armada, this crusade into the Middle East, is creating reasons why Australians will volunteer and join ISIL. Now, they might lock me up for saying that, but this is the fact. You know, this is one of the reasons why, the driving force behind what's happening with ISIL.
I'm pleased that Tanya Plibersek has got the brief she has, because she's one of the more independent-minded members of the Shadow Front Bench. I have no insights into Labour thinking to match those which Richard has insightfully offered. But what I will say is that in Australian federal elections, I'm new to this, you see, I recently became a citizen, so I voted for the first time. In Australian federal elections, as you will know, you have to fill in the voting card all the way down. So all Labour actually has to do is be slightly less objectionable than the coalition to get your vote. And because in practice everybody has to vote, there is no special incentive on the political parties to give you any positive reason to come out and do so. In contrast, it's often said that British general elections are decided by the people who don't come out to vote. So there is an onus on the parties to inspire them to do so. It's precious little inspiration on the Australian political scene, sadly. What we do have is a party, the Greens, which purvey to Australian political debate perspectives that are regarded as mainstream and common sense in much of the informed world, but for which they get treated as lepers or members of a different species here.
Here.
Rumsfeld, I think, said to Saddam Hussein, we don't mind if you invade Kuwait. Now, my reading of this has been that there's a lot of dispute as to what the Americans said to Saddam that made him think that he could go into Kuwait, and that in fact they deny that they said you can go into Kuwait and we won't do anything, because of course they then hit him with a sledgehammer. And it was said he was conned to going into Kuwait as the pretext for invading him. Can you say a little more about the statement that Rumsfeld said you could go into Kuwait, we don't really mind, and then set Saddam up for the invasion that of course has made such a huge difference to the world since?
I can't vouch for his words, and of course that was a paraphrase, a summary if you like, that I said, but there's a wonderful photograph of Rumsfeld in a checked sports coat shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, and it was said at that time that he indicated that there would be no objection or there would be no worry too much about if Saddam territorially expanded to the south. Of course, to the southeast, that's to Kuwait. Look, it's a bit the same as the Americans not objecting to the Russians coming down into Korea. They themselves weren't too concerned about, they didn't see the territorial and the strategic significance of the Korean Peninsula almost until it was too late. And when they did, they were only just recovering from the tremendous fight in Okinawa and regrouping their forces to invade Japan. They had just dropped 2 atom bombs in August 1945. The Russians had declared war on Japan in 1945 and were invading through Manchuria into Korea. And the Americans drew a line in the sand. And they said, you can't cross against the 38th parallel because that's our territory. But until then, the Russians had no reason to think that the Americans would stop them taking over the whole of the peninsula. I think there are some other parallels too, but no, I certainly wouldn't be held to saying that Rumsfeld deliberately said, you know, you've got to go in. No, that was much more subtle than that. And Jake was probably there at the time.
Au contraire, Blackadder. No, there's just one small codicil to that, which is that the picture to which Richard refers of Donald Rumsfeld enthusiastically shaking hands with Saddam Hussein was shown to the American public during the period leading up to the invasion on one program only on US network television. Was it ABC Nightly News with Dan Rather? Was it CBS Evening News? No, it was the Oprah Winfrey Show.
If, as it seems, our Prime Minister really did suggest that he was going to go and teach those shits a lesson with some of our troops, do you think he's actually gone insane?
I don't make comments like that. No, what did they say on the Shane McCall of...
Yeah, I'm not a commentator.
I'm not a commentator. I don't think he's insane. I think he's a bit stupid.
My question relates to the general militarist atmosphere that we're undergoing here in Australia on the centenary of Anzacs. And for $95 you can get a one-person tent to be in Centennial Park on Anzac Eve and watch Gallipoli the film, and then on a TV screen the next morning you can get up for the dawn service, and all the kids will be running around with Dad with their little toy guns and plastic guns pretending they're junior Anzacs without a drop of blood on them, of course. In the centenary of Anzac, there seems to be this tradition going right through that whatever our boys do, they're all Anzacs. Doesn't matter which conflict, who they kill, where they kill, they're all Anzacs. So, you know, if they're just invading Afghanistan and Iraq at the moment, I think we've got troops in about 14 different countries. I don't know if they've all come back from the Solomons yet, but everybody's getting the Anzac stamp. Yeah, okay, well the question is, can you express some desire as to where one can go to find out what's really happening re our federal budget spending on this great bomb-dropping episode in Kobani and places like that where we're 95% destroyed. Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman in America, or is it Cork Watch, or is it Honest History, or is it IPAN? Are they the only places we can find out the truth anymore? And finally, will you participate in the protests against the F-22 American planes down at the Avalon Air Show next month for the 75th anniversary of the Australian Air Force in the lead up to Anzac? And I understand the biggest drone from America in the world is currently touring around Australia.
Wow.
First, a quick comment, seeing most of what you said was comment. It's interesting that John Key is not saying this is an Anzac force. The Kiwis will probably join the Australians, but they're not calling it an Anzac force. Interesting. What was your question? Oh yeah, the budget. Can I say, on the budget, we always get our knickers in a knot about this. Some lone yachtsman goes overboard in the South Pacific and we send down Orion aircraft to rescue him, and they hyperventilate about the cost, millions of dollars per hour that it costs. The fact is that all our aircraft, all our crews, all our ships, all our soldiers have to be paid anyway, whether they're in a conflict or not. But there's extra fuel, there's danger money, there's perks and lurks that they get, which do bump up the cost of things, that's true. But I don't think the government is going to tell us what it's spending. How can it? It's telling all the poor people you've got to pull your drawers in or they'll fall down. It's the most unjust budget we've had for so long. How can they possibly reveal, even if they know the facts, and I bet they don't, what extra expenses they're going to be incurring in this time of asceticism?
I suggest that a war atmosphere in Australia is whipped up as a political spectacle to distract our attention from issues of economic justice. Now, Australia is not like Syria or Iraq or countries which have retained control over their strategic natural resources in order to get the revenues to develop the country. It's a category that also includes Norway, for example. No one's panicking about where the money is going to come from to sustain Norway's public services, because 100% of its oil revenues go into state coffers. How big a percentage of every dollar that comes up out of the ground of Australia's mineral resources, how much stays in Australia? 13 cents. 13 cents, because Australia trod the other route of dismantling barriers to capital accumulation and opening its strategic resources to international speculators instead. Now, it's the set of economic justice issues that is underpinned by those arrangements, which are perceived as being a dangerous political agenda to the interests of capital, and therefore we have to be distracted from them by the summoning up of these bogeymen and an aroused response procured.
Peace movement in Avalon.
Now, the peace movement in Avalon, yes, the centenary of the outbreak of World War I, for example, which was last year and was much feted in various kind of Anzac Day speeches around the country, followed shortly on the heels of the anniversaries, if I'm not mistaken, of the lost referenda for conscription in World War I, successfully campaigned against by the peace movement. There's a legacy for us. Okay. As to military costings, one interesting point is that, of course, the Abbott government chose the week building up to Anzac Day last year to confirm how many of the F-35 fighter jets it was ordering from the United States. No one knows how much they're going to cost. The variant that Australia is buying, seemingly, has a combat range of 1,025 kilometres. And if you drive south from Sydney towards the south coast, as you hit the motorway, there's a sign next to the road that says Melbourne 1,025 kilometres. So it could just about hit Melbourne from Sydney. One way. Fair wind. Of course, that's not its purpose. Its purpose is to be taken elsewhere and used to attack people that America doesn't like. But that didn't stop the then Defence Minister, David Johnston, thinking aloud, a kind of blue skies engineering innovation off the top of his head in a speech somewhere about adapting Australia's amphibious landing vessels, which are designed to carry helicopters, to instead be a platform for the maritime version of the F-35 instead. So, you know, the little-known engineering genius of the Defence Minister is obviously hard at work, and that's why he's been dropped from the ministry. He's been sent to work on that instead. But Lord alone knows how much that will cost.
Thank you for both of those presentations, most informative and illuminating. You mentioned, the question was, why is Australia there? And Australia is there because comes back to why is the US there? And then that leads back to, I think, as both of you speakers may have mentioned, the historical context of this and oil and gas. So my question leads to the oil and gas dependency and sensitivity of the West on the Middle East. My understanding is that the West, in the United States, first started getting involved in the U.S. when some of the American elite convinced Frederick Delano Roosevelt about the importance of Mideast oil and therefore to get involved in this great game, and convinced him to start courting King Faisal during the Second World War. Now, one of the things, I'll wrap it up quite quickly, one of the things that's happened over the last 10 years has been quite a breakthrough in oil and gas technology by the United States, as a result of which the US and North America has become self-sufficient in oil and gas. It no longer depends upon the Middle East for oil and gas. Do you get any sense of this translating into some thinking by the American elite of not being quite so involved in the U.S. as in the Middle East as before? In other words, a bit of a withdrawal, an inevitable withdrawal of the U.S. back to its traditional isolationism. And the attendant questions, if the U.S. did get back into isolationism mode, would that be of net benefit to the world and more selfishly net benefit to Australia?
Glory be.
I think this is an opportunity for me, if I may say so, to emphasise one of the themes that I was developing in my speech. Because you see, one of the most important critiques of the successive invasions of Iraq could be glimpsed in the stickers that were stuck on thousands of bus shelters, post boxes, etc. No blood for oil. And the default setting almost was that, you know, it's all about oil. Well, it begs the question of, in what sense was it all about oil? Now, in late 2002, all 177 or so of the newspapers owned by Rupert Murdoch around the world suddenly started running these bellicose editorials in favour of invading Iraq. And Murdoch gave a rare interview to the late lamented Australian Current Affairs magazine, The Bulletin, in January 2003, and this was put to him, why is this, Mr. Murdoch? And he said, oh, just think of the benefits of invading Iraq. You'd have oil at $20 a barrel. Now, you know, in fact, the opposite was the case. The opposite effect was wrought on the price of oil. So the direct linear consequence anticipated by one of the most identifiable and prominent business supporters of the case for invasion was confounded by the sequence of events. But that doesn't mean that the interests of Rupert Murdoch and those he represents and upon whose behalf he speaks were not furthered in non-linear or extra-linear indirect ways. And that begs the question of, in what sense has this all been about oil? And it's quite interesting that the US commitment to interfering in the Middle East and to lowering these barriers to capital accumulation and to setting a propitious context for American dominance has not changed, in fact, with the changing equation of American self-sufficiency in hydrocarbons. And that's because it's never been about a venal attempt to grab the oil for ourselves. It's always been about controlling access to a strategic resource and the power that confers. And that's a very important distinction, because what it means is that we cannot read back that power from behaviour. We can't detect what's going on if we are equipped only with a behavioural view of power. What I'm giving you is the very important writings of Stephen Lutz, who published a very influential essay called Power, A Radical View, just over 40 years ago. What he emphasises instead is that power is that which arises and is distributed and indeed networked and takes effect in the spaces around and between the observable behaviour. It's the structural effect of the power which is responsible for the sequence of events we can observe, including this repeat syndrome of interfering in these oil-rich countries.
I think America's got the habit of wanting to have power, as Jake says, in this area, and they'll continue to have it, even though they're a failing superpower themselves. Saudi Arabia is their great mate, even though the Saudis have been unconscionably supporting ISIL through the back door, and there are a lot of Saudis who feel exactly the same as ISIL does, and yet they're forgiven that because it's such an asset to the United States to have Saudi Arabia with all its oil on site. It's the largest oil repository probably in the world. Iran, they lost Iran. Iran, when I was there in the embassy in Tehran in the early 70s, was pumping out 8 million barrels of oil a day. The Yanks and the Europeans lost that. But then, as Jake said, I think they took down Mossadegh because he wanted to nationalise the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and that was the beginning of American political interference in the Middle East. Anyway, I think also you've got to remember that this ISIL threat and the people who flock to it from Western countries does actually represent a bit of an existential threat to American civil calmness, or whatever you want to, however delicately you want to put it, and in Europe too. So it's not just oil. There's another element suddenly at play as well. The beast has been created, in my view, as I said earlier, by the invasion, the illegal invasion of the United States of Iraq. Thank you.
To Jake and Richard, I was wondering what you think of the proposition that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, is blowback from the Cold War, given the amount of billions of dollars that the US spent through Pakistan in supporting the Mujahideen against a popular left-wing government in Afghanistan, which was subsequently supported by the Soviets under the Brezhnev doctrine. So they've created this monster, they've created the mess that we're in, political Islamic fundamentalism, Islamofascism, if you like, was used as a tool to suppress secular left-wing nationalist movements in the Middle East post-war. What do you feel about that?
I think that it certainly has some elements of that, but I think, yes, Afghanistan, the blowback from that, supporting what later became Taliban by the Americans to defeat the Russians, all that is part of it. But it goes back well before that. In fact, it goes back to the 7th century when there was a schism between the Sunnis and the Shia over who the prophet's successor would be. And you think, well, isn't it crazy that this has led to such enormous bloodletting between the Shia and the Sunnis? And yet, when you look at the comparison in a Christian country, say between Croatia and Serbia, they both speak the same language. They're both Christians, and yet one is Catholic and the other is Orthodox, and they hate each other's guts. So it's not just Islam in which you've had this kind of schism and this movement. Now, I'm afraid it's systemic, it's endemic, it goes back historically to the roots of Islam. It's been exacerbated by Western interference. It's been exacerbated by a feeling of resentment that Western countries are ganging up against Islam. But look at Boko Haram in Nigeria. Look at the other enormously bloodthirsty movements that are developing in these countries, and the absolute lack of any humanitarian principles that they operate on, the way they capture young girls and drag them off, and they're just chattels. I mean, this is just and the way they kill people. I don't think we're quite so bad, although we used to do this in the Christian world, certainly under the Spanish Catholics in the 15th century.
Recent.
I'll make a number of points. The first point is, and I think it's important to state this, that the overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world abhor and denigrate the violence and the killings that Richard mentions just as much as anyone else. And to proceed, as many in politics and the media do here, and harp on only about the Islamic State without saying that, I think is a form of Islamophobia. Secondly, as I mentioned in my speech, I think these countries in the post-colonial space of the Middle East have been a testbed for the implantation of Western notions of sovereignty. And state sovereignty in the Western conception is indivisible. However, there are a number of rival claims on people's sense of loyalty which have a much longer history in that part of the world, including Islam, also including tribalism, also including Pan-Arabism, and it's that kind of sense of an appeal to something older and perhaps more authentically homegrown that is, or can be glimpsed in the ISIL video that I mentioned when they're chanting down with Sykes-Picot. The third point I would make is that yes, there are a small number of extremely violent people who go around committing violence in the name of Islam, and they use a twisted and perverted version of Islam in attempts to justify their actions. However, in the period that we're talking about, you could call it the post-9/11 period. You could demarcate it in that way. As Richard Pearl said in 2001, Richard Pearl was a senior neoconservative, any attempt to discuss the roots of terrorism is an attempt to justify it. It must simply be fought and destroyed. And of course, because of that disavowal of social structure and process, all we have had left is fighting and destroying, and there's been a great deal of that. The overwhelming majority of the fighting and destroying has been explicitly justified with reference to Christian just war theory. Nothing to do with Islam.
My question really is a follow-up in some ways to the previous question. It seems to me when you look at the divisions and the wars that are occurring in the Middle East, there's two sides to the equation. One is the Western interference and the Western divide and rule tactics, which go back a long time. But the other is, following the previous question, what really amounts to the destruction of the left and progressive nationalist movement in the Middle East. You know, with all its faults, Nasserism, with the original Ba'athist idea, which at least had a left character to some extent, the role of the communist parties and socialist forces, and even within the Palestinian movement. So we've actually seen two things happening. On the one hand, an increase in Western invasions and interference and the destruction, but part of that has been to destroy the progressive movement. Without saying too much more, I just want to give a contrast. Another part of the world where the United States has been dominant for even longer is South America, Latin America, in fact. And Latin America is going the other way. Latin America is moving to the left, and it is developing its independence and progressive governments of various stripes. And the US is actually being more and more kicked out of Latin America. Anyway, we could say a lot more about that, but it seems to me there are there's not an inevitability about the way things have gone in the Middle East, that there is another road, and we can see that already in another part of the world. Just the final point is just to say that even the Arab Spring, which we all had so much hope for, seems in this context to have been destroyed and turned into pretty much a disaster in the Middle East, and hasn't produced the progressive reforms that we would have hoped. We just have to look at Egypt.
Excellent.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
Okay, they've decided that those were just comments and no questions. So there was not a question in that. So can the next question be asked, please?
Okay.
Just in very brief answer, I sympathise with the question. I think that one could say that attempts at nation building in the Middle East have failed. One could equally well say they have been sabotaged.
Yes, I think we'd probably all agree that the 2003 invasion of Iraq was an unmitigated failure, and it's caused or brought about the chaos that we see there now. Now, in view of that, my view is that those who make decisions and formulate policy for the country should be asking some very serious questions about the nature of the alliance that got us into that. The contrary seems to be what's happening. So my question is, are there no clear-thinking people in our defence establishment?
Yes or no? That's a bit of an oxymoron. No, it's not.
That was a Dorothy Dixon.
Yes, there are, but they're also subject, in my experience, to conformity and to having to think within certain parameters. It's a bit like foreign affairs. When I was a younger officer in the department, we were allowed to offer frank and fearless advice, and often did. And we chanced our arm. I fell on some good times with Bill Hayden, who seemed to appreciate this, and he sort of mentored me to some extent. But it all changed when it wasn't just Alexander Downer, it was before him. I think probably Paul Keating began to say, look, you have a certain parameters and you have to stick within them. But certainly Downer was a bully as a foreign minister, and someone I didn't respect very much at all, and didn't appreciate speculation about whether our policies in a certain country or other in which we were representing Australia were the right ones. Of course, there's a great deal of discomfort in Vietnam, about Vietnam, But here again, you see, a lot of people who had ambitions in the department and wanted to get ahead would not rock the boat too much because they'd be accused of lack of judgment. A fortiori, think of that in the military. At Duntroon, in the Australian Defence Academy, I think you have a similar thing. Even the way these young uniformed men and women walk around the campus in lockstep indicates a certain mental straitjacket that they're subject to. So, of course, bright people, there are people with independent thoughts, but in the establishment that we have in Australia today, sadly, they don't express it.
Andrew Wilkie did, and they sent him off to a psychiatrist.
One of the greatest defeats inflicted on barbaric state or IS has been from the Kurds in Kobani, and certainly among all the usual American stuff-ups with their involvement there for last year, one of the few exceptions to that maybe has been belatedly finally dropping some arms to help the Kurds there. But on the other hand, it's extremely unjust that particularly the Kurdistan Workers' Party, who were so instrumental in defeating the IS there, still prescribed in most Western countries as a terrorist organisation, even though they're a secular group and completely different. Certainly don't pose any threat to the West like the religiously fundamentalist groups would seem to do. So my question is there any hope for the any of the countries in Western Europe maybe and so on in finally acknowledging the Kurdistan Workers' Party as a legitimate organisation instead of as a terrorist organisation, or do you think they're too cowed by the US to ever do that?
Look, the situation is so fluid at present, and there's so little knowledge getting out about really what's going on that it's very hard to answer this question at all. Yes, Peshmerga has done quite well, and yes, the Kurds have halted to some extent with massive support, small arms and heavier weapons against ISIL, but ISIL has adapted its tactics. The stuff I read indicates that they no longer assemble in any kind of groups in daylight. They move at night, they move furtively, and it's very hard to do anything about them. The biggest test is coming up, and that is whether combined forces supporting the Iraq government can take back Mosul from ISIL, and that's where it is now. That's a city of 2 million people. It's going to be much worse than Fallujah, but thank goodness the Americans don't have the firepower that they had that that's decimated as 1 in 10, that actually destroyed such a lot of Fallujah. They haven't yet brought in depleted uranium weapons either, to my knowledge, but this is where it's going. This is where it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I think there's going to be a lot of blood in the sand before that one is resolved. And our government deliberately is not telling us. Not that I think they know too much about what's going on. Probably the special forces do, but they're discouraged from saying anything to anyone. But it's a murky situation, and we really cannot indicate which way this thing is going to go or has been going for the time being. Jade.
I'm not sure it's quite an answer to your question, but governments have been hardened in their habit of not telling us what's going on by the fact that policies which are virtually consensual among the political elite have decisively lost support among publics around the world. And that is why the characteristically neoliberal policy settings contained in Joe Hockey's budget have proved so difficult to enact. Now, what happens, therefore, is that those policies, the characteristic privatisation, deregulation, austerity, etc., are increasingly being imposed by force of various kinds. Not only the literal sense of the use of force to lower these barriers to capital accumulation in countries in the Middle East, but also, I mean, let me just draw your attention to the agenda which is set in a very welcome way by this paper I picked up, The Guardian. We should be talking about these trade agreements. People in Britain are talking much more about the transatlantic trade partnership than we are here about the trans-Pacific trade partnership, but they are a mirror image of each other. And what they propose is that the people who will decide whether or not to parcel out a portion of a public service, such as a health service or a university for that matter, to some private sector outfit, is not politicians, is not even a domestic court, but a special court made up only of corporate representatives that will meet in secret.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's because people have seen through these austerity policies and these neoliberal policies that they are having to be hived off more and more into the realm of secrecy. And that is hardening governments in their habit of, as Richard said, treating us like mushrooms.
Thank you.
I'd like everyone to thank the speakers for tonight, please.